Hey everyone. I wanted to take a couple minutes this afternoon and go over To Kill a Mockingbird, chapters 12 and 13. Um, so I want to reiterate again, you should already have read the chapters assigned before going through this. Um, this is sort of just to clarify and touch on some of the key points and ideas and characters that we are going to be um, tracing throughout the entire book, maybe some themes and other evaluative measures that will be important for you to know. Um, there are also a lot of helps online that you're welcome to utilize, but these are sort of things that I want you to know beyond just who are the characters, what are key details about their lives, what are some of the things that they do. Let's just dive into chapters 12 and 13. I think a theme that we'll be running throughout this lesson today is contrasts, contrasting characters, contrasting ideas. We start in chapter 12 with Jem growing up. Jem is now 12. Scout professes that he is difficult to live with. He's inconsistent. He's moody. He's appalling, has an appalling appetite. And it says, overnight, Jem had acquired an alien set of values and was imposing them on me. In addition to Jem's newly developed characteristics, he had acquired a maddening air of wisdom. Oh, go on and leave me alone. I'm reading the paper. So Jem is no longer the little boy that was poking fun at Boo Radley. We've already seen some growth in him, but it seems to Scout at least that suddenly overnight he's a different person. And so we're going to look at why that might be. The questions I want to ask is, why does Jem change so quickly, and why do youth tend to be inconsistent and moody? And it plays into this theme of childhood and growing up, where there's an awareness that tends to come upon a young person where suddenly they're no longer sheltered, they're no longer innocent or naive about some of life's difficulties or challenges, and it results in a manifestation of fear or distrust or a deconstruction of the fantasy that they once held about people and about values and what might be important in life. And this can oftentimes lead to cynicism. And so, going along with that theme, it depends on where you get this information, sort of how you end up processing it, whether it becomes fear, whether it becomes pride, whether it becomes cynical. And so, in the previous quote, we saw that Scout was observing that Jem was reading the newspaper. So, the source of the knowledge predisposes an individual toward a certain belief. So whether it's the newspaper that he was partaking in, whether it was the town gossip or tradition or family values that shaped the person, whatever it might be, when a person becomes aware for the first time, it opens their eyes and they can no longer maintain that innocence. Further, we see through Jem and through this character that youth begin to establish individual value systems, and that's what's happening with him. And Scout really doesn't have a role in that. So kind of table that for a bit, because as you can kind of assume, that has been foreshadowed slightly, there is going to continue to be growth in the characters. So this is just the beginning of Mr. Jem. We move on to Scout and Jem attending Calpurnia's church one Sunday when Atticus is out of town. And the first thing is that she scrubs them down and she washes them as they've never been washed before. Scout has a dress that's starched so significantly that it poofs out like a pillow all around her. She has to wear a pink satin sash around her waist, which she's not too happy about. But again, appearances are really important in this culture, regardless of what race or basically station in life. So keep that in mind as a note. We'll encounter some characters at Calpurnia's church. There's Zebo, who is Calpurnia's son, and then Reverend Sykes is the pastor at the church. And then you have, well, I guess I can make this larger for you. And then there's also Lula, and Lula is symbolic of reverse racism. So as you encounter each of these different characters or individuals, you're going to see that they respond differently. Zebo is very welcoming and kind, and Reverend Sykes is glad to have the children a part of his congregation. But there's Lula who stops Calpurnia at the sidewalk and basically says, they have their own church. I don't want them at our church, basically. And Calpurnia insists, they're my company, and my company is always welcome. And so I want to note that racism does go both directions. That is not something that the book is trying to gloss over. So that would be called reverse racism that we see there. And you can see that throughout the entire chapter. Another thing to note about the church is that there are no hymnals. Why? Is it that they're too poor? It ends up being in the end that they can't read. But why is this significant? To kind of, the hymnals come up 1 or 2 or 3 times throughout the chapter as a symbolic element. And what do they symbolize? That the African American population, maybe they cannot read, maybe they are lower class, but they're extremely bright, and their vocal abilities are far superior to anything that Scout or Gem have ever experienced. And so regardless of what the social status and class might say about them, they are very mentally apt and truly judged incorrectly by the majority of people. So that becomes symbolic. And then finally, there's some interesting elements with regard to their community. One being the forced tithe. Reverend Sykes asks to take up a collection for Helen Robinson, Tom Robinson's wife, because she is out of work and she has to stay home with the children. And everybody gives sacrificially, but he closes the doors and says, no one's leaving until we get $10. And so he forces and calls people out by name to come up and tithe. If you hadn't read that, it's a pretty interesting section. And what's the significance of that? It's, again, let's keep in mind that these chapters are going to bring up contrasts, and there's a contrast here between the African American community and the white community, and this shows that they have each other's backs. They are bearing one another's burdens, that Christian principle, that Christian precept, in a way that the white community is going to absolutely do the opposite and sort of mock one another's difficulties and shun one another in a place of challenge. And we're meant to just be left with that, to think, what do we do with this contrast? Which one's better? Which one's worse? And it's fairly obvious. And you get that contrast again at the end of the chapter where they're talking about the difference between the Robinsons and the Yules. So you can read that. We get more insight into Calpurnia in this chapter. She essentially speaks 2 languages and lives in 2 worlds. She lives in the white, rich world, not rich, but like well-titled world. And even though nobody really has a lot of money at this time, the Finches are fairly well off. She is educated, she can read, but then the kids see a completely different side of her. She speaks, Scout says, 2 languages. It's the dialect of the African American people. The uneducated, those they don't as a whole read, and so she speaks differently, which shows that she's not trying to put on airs. She's modest and humble, and she has this great quote, says, it's not necessary to tell all that you know. It's not ladylike. In the second place, folks don't like to have somebody around knowing more than they do. It aggravates them. You're not going to change any one of them by talking, right? They've got to want to learn themselves. And when they don't want to learn, there's nothing you can do but keep your mouth shut or talk their language. And she shows incredible wisdom here that most of the other characters do not have. So it's important to take this bit of humility and this bit of wisdom and contrast it next with Aunt Alexandra. Aunt Alexandra is described by Scout as having a way of declaring what is best for the family. She gets her way. She's bossy. She was an incurable gossip. She's a busybody. She was never bored, and given the slightest chance, she would exercise her royal prerogative. That was a vocab word, by the way. She would arrange, advise, caution, and warn. So she's mixing in everyone's business, trying to tell them what to do. She's prideful. She never let a chance escape her to point out the shortcomings of all other groups to the greater glory of our own. And this was reference to her missionary circles of women. Lastly, Aunt Alexandra is painted as being judgmental. Everybody in Macomb, it seemed, had a streak, a drinking streak, a gambling streak, a mean streak, a funny streak, and she would label people and judge them and criticize them accordingly. So that's Aunt Alexandra. How does that contrast to what we know of Calpurnia in her modest humility? So here's a portrait, if you will, of Aunt Alexandra. She says, today was Sunday, and Aunt Alexandra was positively irritable on the Lord's Day. I guess it was her Sunday corset. She wasn't fat, but solid, and she chose protective garments that drew up her bosom to giddy heights, pinched in her waist, flared out her rear, and managed to suggest that Aunt Alexandra was once an hourglass figure. From any angle, it was formidable. If you deconstruct that quote, everything about her is trying to appear to be something it's not, whereas Calpurnia absolutely was something and did nothing to show it off. And so you have the contrast of like humble and wise with one who is a gossip and putting on airs and trying to be something and uphold an appearance. And so those two go together to speak about this theme of the social status or the caste system in Macomb, what are called fine folks. Scout says, I received the impression that fine folks were people who did the best they could with what the sense that they had. But Aunt Alexandra was of the opinion, obliquely expressed, that the longer a family had been squatting on one patch of land, the finer it was. Jem responds, that makes the Yules fine folks. The tribe of which Burris Yule and his brethren consisted had lived on the same plot of earth behind the Macomb dump and had thrived on county welfare money for 3 generations. We have to understand the significance of this. In this divided world, you have the Yules on top, those who had squatted on a piece of land, a garbage dump, living off of welfare, doing nothing for themselves or to better themselves or their community, essentially rejecting kindness and service to others and self-sacrifice and humility in favor of just sort of like longevity and name. They stand over and above a lot of the characters that we meet in chapter 12 that are in Calpurnia's church, that are hardworking, that are self-sacrificing, that are kind to one another. And so that's really important. And then lastly, the quote, and as Aunt Alexandra continues to live with the Finch family, she has come to move in and basically change them. And she says, Atticus, you need to educate your children. You need to tell them who they are. So it says Atticus kind of grew serious and he stumbles in the room and in his lawyer's voice said, your aunt has asked me to try and impress upon you and Jean Louise that you are not from run-of-the-mill people. You are the product of several generations' gentle breeding. You should try to live up to your name. Atticus persevered in spite of us. She asked me to tell you you must try to behave like a little lady and gentleman that you are. She wants to talk to you about the family and what it's meant to Macomb County through the years, so you'll have some idea of who you are, so you might be moved to behave accordingly. And so, in sort of a force of hand by Aunt Alexandra, Atticus has to teach the children, you are Finches. You really want us to do all that? Scout asked. I can't remember everything Finches are supposed to do. And then Atticus said, I actually don't want you to remember it. Forget it. So Scout and Jem are stuck in the middle between the authenticity of Atticus and Calpurnia and the absolute foolishness and lack of wisdom and cultural filth that is the appearance and airs of Aunt Alexandra and everyone else in the town. And so we'll see how this plays out as we continue, and I'd like you to discuss some of those differences and challenges today or whenever it's assigned on Flipgrid. So thanks.